for me, it's a pleasure to be here with you at this meeting called Data Interoperability and Digital Integration, Integrating Parliamentary Resource and Information. It's brought to you by Bússola Tech. Thank you very much for your audience. When we talk about interoperability, we are talking about the capability that systems might have to exchange data and talk to each other. But in spite of so many technologies that were proposed to solve this problem everywhere, it remains a challenge, even for systems which are under the same roof. Can you mind about systems that are oceans apart, literally? That's the subject of our meeting today. And I would like to start with a question from the user's point of view. For those who use open data, especially open data that comes from different legislative houses around the world, how manual, how hard, and how tricky is to do it? I would like to start with Jonathan, who works with that. And I believe that you, Jonathan, might have some struggles and some stories to tell us about how to work with all these different open data systems, all these different APIs. Please, Jonathan.
Definitely. Yeah, no, thank you. Welcome, everyone. And thanks for having me as well as part of this panel. It's quite an interesting thing when we look at, how manual, how hard, and how tricky is using open data as an example. And I think, one of the sort of issues we have is how we actually store that data to start off with. And one of the sort of things is that a lot of the parliaments that we actually deal with are still very sort of much wedded into, say, Microsoft Word, or, generating sort of content which is actually not very easily accessible at the end of the day. So one of the biggest challenges we have is, how do we create content that is actually open, that, for example, like some of the things which we've sort of noticed in the past is that we were working with one of the sort of federal parliaments, and they just published all of their content as PDF documents. And one of the issues they were sort of having was that agencies such as, finance or health, etc., had to actually then download all these PDF documents to get the latest ministries or the latest information about Parliament, and manually copy paste that information into their own systems as well. So if you look at, say, for example, with the sort of legislative houses and the parliaments, etc., is that they become the authoritative source of truth for a lot of consumers out there. And open data is really, really becoming a lot more important when we need to look at that consumption side of things. So whether that be from citizens' point of view, whether that be from private enterprise, whether that be from even other government agencies as well. So it can be quite tricky, because parliaments have been around for a very long time, and a lot of people get wedded in their ways of actually operating as well. So they're used to creating a Word document, or they're just used to saving it as a PDF, putting it onto the public website, and they're done with it. So to me, it's a lot about that. Education is going to be part of a tricky side of things, and part of the complexity is really about some of that training point of view to say, how can we actually get that in a more open data format, to those consumers as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'd like to ask to my very close colleague Florian from the Brazilian Federal Senate, which is meters apart from the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies, literally, but we do have very different open data APIs. Users say that. And Florian, what do you see that could be the biggest struggle that users might face after, for example, those human document-based formats, like Jonathan said, the PDF, published data? What else could be a hurdle for users to actually have interoperability between different sources of data, in your opinion?
Okay, I guess the greatest challenge is to overcome the internal practices in the parliament. I agree with Jonathan, what he said. There are practices that there is a long time. So to overcome it is a challenge to publish data in an interoperated way. But let me first, Fabricio, introduce myself. I work in the Senate. I'm currently serving in the Transparency Office of the Senate, which manages the transparency website, for example. I guess the reason why I was invited to participate of this panel is that because I coordinated the development of Panorama do Legislativo Municipal. In English would be Local Legislatures Overview, which is an app focused data visualization, which integrates, which gathers data about more than 5,000 local legislatures in Brazil. You know, and I'll try to answer this question that you proposed based on my experience in developing this app. And I guess that Brazil has made huge progress publishing open data in the last years. And I guess there are two milestones in this process. The first would be the Freedom of Information Act in 2011. And the second would be the Data Protection Act in 2018. After those two enactments of the laws, the data the publish of data was stimulated, and nowadays we have many public repositories. So this allowed us to create and develop the Panorama, the Local Legislatures Overview, which is a huge progress. But we faced some problems dealing with these data. And I think the lack of standard is the main problem that we had. We had to create patterns to publish these data. A second problem we faced was the lack of metadata. You know, there is no, in many cases, there is no code book, so we have to imagine what is this data about. And the third problem would be the level of granularity, for example, is different from different databases. So these problems could be tricky dealing with data in Brazil, I guess, based in this experience.
That's fine, Florian. Thank you very much. It's a very important experience, of course, you had by integrating these probably so different systems into one big database. And that's actually what most users try to do when they mash up data from different sources. Elhanan from Israel Ministry of Justice, would you like to add something from the user's point of view to this topic?
Yes, so I'm working for the Ministry of Justice in Israel. I'm leading the ELO initiative. It's an initiative that aims to make a collaboration way to exchange all the legislative data in the pre-parliamentary phase. And in that, we are also building and editing tools for the drafters. So this is more like my working. So I can describe this question, the answer from the government's point of view. In Israel, we have only one house, the Knesset, and this is the parliament, and we have a strong relationship with the parliament and the government. And the Knesset, it's the political structure in Israel caused that the government have a lot of influence inside the Knesset. So there is a lot of, for example, when they want to promote governmental legislative for a legislative process. In the last years, we have a lot of progress in promoting openness to data, mainly because the government decision that received in 2016 that opened by default, mean that governmental data will be open. So the Knesset now expose most of the data, the parliamentary data, by OData protocol, which in fact they expose the core of the parliamentary activities that allowing agencies and the publics to consume the data, which is very, very nice and very good because a lot of implementation have built above this. In the government, it's less open. The governmental process, it's less open than in the Knesset. We want to improve this. We are working on this to be much more transparent to the public and to the other agency. We have now the DataGov initiative that exposes more than thousands of databases, different databases, governmental databases to the publics, and for much more exchange data, we have we call it information avenue. It's like a hub that helped to exchange data between agencies. We call it G2G, or between government and business, it's B2G, or with the citizen with it G2C. So this is on one leg our experience.
Fine, Elhanan, thank you. What about you, Bruno, from the Cámara de Diputados de Mexico? Bruno.
In our case, to be honest, it's usually manual, difficult, and complicated. This is because in the legislative domain, technology has not been prioritized, leading to the legislative process being primarily conducted manually. The lack of the technological integration hinders the efficient extraction of analysis of data, required additional effort to collect and process information manually. Therefore, there are need to drive regulatory changes to integrate the technology into legislative process. This is the real problem here in Mexico.
That's fine, Bruno. I think that's a reality for many users, actually. I think you briefly talked about something that might be a reality elsewhere, and I can see from my own experience that as well, that interoperability is usually not one of the first-class requirements we see when developing systems, especially those that are developed for internal necessities of a legislative house. Publishing this data actually was not one of the requirements when they were made, when such applications were written. One of the things that I would like to bring about is discoverability, which is an important part of interoperability. I remember reading some of the papers from Tim Berners-Lee from the initial work he made in order to build what will become the internet as we know it. And one of his main concerns was about describing the link relations between different internet resources in order to make the hyperlinking thing to have meaning on itself and make systems more discoverable. And I would like to ask you, how discoverable are data APIs today and other sources of information, such as files, or even if they are in open standards? How do you find data sources to integrate, to gather together when you need? Is it also a manual process? Is there an example or a trend or a technology that you guys think that would be useful to make data sources more discoverable? I'd like to start with Elhanan, please.
Okay, I don't know to estimate the amount in the world in general. I believe that not much in related to the the exposed information we have, I don't think that the trend of the technologies of implementing is the issue. I think that much more is the exposure itself. I think that there is two factors. If you put the data outside and you just publish it, there is a lot of researchers and agencies, organizations, NGOs, government agencies that want to consume it. So for that purpose, so I believe that even if the data is not well organized, somebody will take it and will do its good thing. Last advance in artificial intelligence allowing to extract insight even when the data is not well formed, and so it's important to have the discoverability, especially to when we want to scan a lot of data. I cannot answer it because it's complex with many layers that we don't have the time to elaborate them, but there is some points. There is the autonomy of the agency or the governmental policy, the exchange of the technologies that cause to difference, and of course there is aspects of security and privacy that you need to take into account.
That's fine, Elhanan. What about Florian?
Yeah, I will mention again the regulation landmarks of my first speech. And I want to highlight one point, because interoperability and is mentioned by the Data Protection Act in Brazil, for example. And Brazil has made huge progress after the enactment of this law. So I guess the discoverability issue is somehow has made progress after the enactment of this law. So I want to highlight the point of the political sphere interfering in the progress of the data availability. Is one point I want to highlight.
Would you like to detail it a bit more? Or which kind of interference and political interference do you see happening in the subject?
No, the political, I mean, since the law enactment, Brazil has made a huge progress, and the law was made by legislators. So somehow the political interfered in the data availability in Brazil, and this is one point I wanna highlight. I will make this point of view because I'm not a TI expert nor a data scientist, so I will share my view as a user here. Just and I guess that was invited me because I developed that app. So I try to bring a different perspective of the issue that you're proposing.
Yeah, that's fine. Fair enough. Fair enough. Bruno, you said that using data is hard by itself. It's complicated. It's manual. To discover sources of data is as well as complicated.
Well, the kind of discoverability is greatly improved by artificial intelligence, but I don't think that's the problem we need to discuss right now. The real problem lies in the relating not standardized information, which pose the risk of artificial intelligence generate less precise results than expected.
Would you like to elaborate more on that, please?
Well, the artificial intelligence is very powerful, but the relationships between the sources is very important to be more standardization because the results are more effective.
That's fine. Jonathan, you have been working a lot with artificial intelligence, as far as I know.
Mhm.
Do you agree with all that Florian and Bruno said about the usage of artificial intelligence in discoverability of data sources?
I think that's one aspect of it, but I think it's also, as sort of Florian was also saying, is that there's also then the political will to actually then convert what I call the traditional formats into that sort of more open data formats. And we had a conversation, it was probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago with the Parliament, and we said like, oh, we should make sure that we publish for, open data sets and open APIs, etc. And the first response was no. And I said, well, at the end of the day, you are publishing that information, but just in a hard format to retrieve. So the PDF formats or the other formats which were actually part of that. And I said, well, there's really no difference between this public information. So there's really no difference if you have that data to transform it from that sort of hard to read format into a more manageable format as well. And one of the things which we've done over the last sort of 5 to 6 years as well is that we've started to collate a centralized like a web page where we're actually listing all of the open data sets from parliaments around the world that we actually know about. And that's one of the initiatives which we've actually done, because every single implementation that we've done with a parliament, we do actually have standardized open API sets and data sets which actually go along with that as well. So that could be members, committees, petitions, broadcasting, and a whole range of other things. And one of the biggest sort of aspects is around is trying to make sure that it's a standardized format and a standardized approach is really going to help with that sort of discoverability side of things. And as sort of Elhanan was sort of saying as well, one of his comments was that if you actually put that information out there, people will discover it naturally as well. So if we looked at, for example, one of the open APIs that we did, this is probably going back 6 or 7 years ago for one of the parliaments, and then we upgraded one of the versions probably, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and the parliament decided to change something and make a breaking change. And the amount of feedback which we had from these people, which we didn't even know were consuming that API, and it was external legal firms, it was, government agencies, and there was a big uproar because something actually got broken, but Parliament actually thought nobody was using it. So what we actually find is that by putting links out there and putting data out there, is that people will start, consuming that as well, from a very sort of large perspective as well. So yeah.
Just by publishing the links is enough, in your opinion, I think?
It's one of the areas to make sure that we've got both transparency from a parliament point of view as well. And I think where you can start to use artificial intelligence is really about then mining that information and really sort of understanding what that information and the trend analysis is as well around that. If you look at some of the data which we've published in an open data format, that's going back to the 1800s. So we've got, hundreds and hundreds of years of data which can be analyzed. And that's when we can start to use artificial intelligence and machine learning, etc., to really gain a really interesting aspect around how parliaments and how the sort of legislation has actually evolved over a couple of 100 years, as an example. And it's only possible by having interoperability and also by having those sort of open data sets published as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have talked about the lack of standards as one of the issues that we have in data interoperability, and you guys brought the subject earlier than I thought. Artificial intelligence is, of course, it's blooming and it's very powerful already. When should we? Is artificial intelligence really powerful enough so we don't have to worry anymore about standards? Can we just leave it to the AI to figure out the data formats and their meanings? Or do you guys think that we still have a lot to do about standardization? Jonathan, would you like to start? You have been working with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's two parts to it. Parliaments have quite structured data and unstructured data. And so if you look at, for example, legislation, or if you look at transcripts or Hansard as an example, it is quite structured in terms of the content. So the use of artificial intelligence is one of those sort of areas that you can start to get insights into that content. And we use artificial intelligence quite significantly around both structured data and unstructured data as well, because they both provide different insights into what that content is. So, and again, like, because parliaments have changed over a significant period of time, that content has actually changed and the format has changed over a large period of time too. So there isn't really consistency over a long period of time. So what we need to then do is say, well, actually, artificial intelligence can provide a tool to help understand the content. But I still don't think it is a replacement of content. So, for example, you know, we've debated in previous sort of sessions as well, where, you know, what is the tool of using artificial intelligence to generate a draft of legislation on a specific topic, as an example. And, you know, it still needs to be reviewed by humans. And I've always sort of taken the viewpoint of artificial intelligence is a tool to supplement your work, not to replace your work. So you still need to have a really core understanding of what that artificial intelligence has actually generated. Has that actually generated, you know, the correct, and we sort of actually, I was debating this last night with the sort of from a multilingual point of view, is that let's say we use artificial intelligence to translate something into different languages. Now, if your accuracy is, say, 90%, so 90% over an 8-hour period, 10% over that 8 hours is actually potentially incorrect. And that could actually fundamentally change the intent or the meaning behind what people are actually speaking within Parliament. So therefore, if you rely on a non-translated or non-authoritative source, for example, in that scenario, you know, that could have dramatic consequences for the actual act of Parliament itself. So I think artificial intelligence is obviously a big buzzword at the moment, but it's on a growth trajectory where I think it needs to be a measured implementation, and it needs to have governance, and it also needs to have a lot of understanding of why you're actually going to be using it too.
That's fine, Jonathan. Thanks. Bruno, you brought the subject of artificial intelligence before. Would you like to add to that? Do you think that artificial intelligence is good enough already to increase interoperability in a sensible way, just like Jonathan said? Can you trust it?
Well, the artificial intelligence is very great today, but when you get the sources many different ways, the data, the result of the data is very easy to change the meaning of the data. And this is a very a risk in the parliamentary environment. And I think the the really problem is the not is the structured sources.
All right, Bruno. Elhanan, do you think that we could use standards to make things easier for artificial intelligence to figure out what the data is itself?
That of course, if the standard can help an artificial intelligence. But if we look on the trends and the jump in the hit that we experienced in this year, but in years before, in the large generative models, yet it's not a strong intelligence, but there is a trend, and yet we need to give some context to the data, because without the context, the artificial intelligence can misinterpret the information. Even when she got the right content, she invite this is invite thing. So it's even worse when there is lack of content. But if we look on the development that it's so accelerated this year, so it's very hard to see what to forecast what we will have in a year from now, or many years from now, 2 years from now, and not so much. I can try answering on this question from another perspective that we are examining. This is a rule as a code, and in the rule as a code, this is very exciting issues that we think how we can transform rules to a code, and there is a standards, but not a lot of in a low scale implementation in around the world. I don't know if there is one government, maybe in New Zealand, that they try to figure out how to use it. But somebody says, there is a lot of voices that said, why do you need to develop standards for rule as a code? Look, if you ask the artificial, the big generative AI, and it gives the answer, even if it invented the answer and generated the answer, but it's the correct one. It's not based on rules, on some. It gave the correct answer in very nice accuracy, even if you ask the reasoning, and the reason is generated. So why do you need all this standard? I don't know to answer, to give a precise answer for this question.
That's fine. You talked about rule as a code. I will look at that. It interests me a lot. Florian, from the Brazilian Senate. Can you imagine the consequences of artificial intelligence making a slight mistake on a political sensitive subject, such as a legislation, a proposal, something being discussed in the Senate?
It's hard to imagine what's going to happen, but I mainly agree with the other participants. I don't think we can rely on artificial intelligence to determine standards. I guess it still depends to be trained by humans. But when it is the point, you proposed the question, and I made the question to ChatGPT, and to listen by the artificial intelligence itself what she would say about this issue. And the ChatGPT answer was very careful. Actually, it says that rely on artificial intelligence to determine standards may lead to unintended consequences, biases, and challenges in ensuring transparency and accountability. So I don't know if it is too much careful, if we can believe it or not, but currently we can't rely solely on artificial intelligence. But as mentioned by Mr. Schwartz, everything is so fast, is happening. We don't know in the future what's going to be.
That's fine. Well, We have, since the late 90s, we have some standards proposed by Internet standard authorities such as the W3C for improving data interoperability and communication, and about adding metadata and meaning to published data, such as RDF, ontologies, things like that. It's almost more than 20 years ago it happened, and we still don't see these technologies being widely used. I'd like to ask you, what do you think is wrong with such proposed standards? They are there and they seem powerful, but they're not so widely used. They might work, they might provide much that we need to overcome the difficulties in making different systems work together. And why aren't these technologies used, in your opinion? Bruno, would you like to start with that?
The lack of the official update and recommendation of the HTTP options methods as a way to get the tailored and easy instruction for machines can be due to several reasons. I think there are a lack of consensus on its implementation for its use more widely. Speaking in the legislative field, I think that these types of initiatives should be promoted by the Congresses themselves, since due to the lack of legislations of these matters. These types of proposals remain in the background, and therefore their implementations loses popularity.
That's fine. Elhanan, what do you think? Is there something wrong in the proposed standards, or have they just became, how would I say, deprecated or too old?
I don't know about it, and I don't know why, especially the RDF or the semantic web you mentioned. We, for example, I mentioned that we work on the rule as a code, and we try to examine the legal rule ML, and which is connected somehow to the RDF, and we are working on developing an Israeli standard for legislative. We call it AKN for AL, which is based on Akomantoso, and which is also a technology that corresponded with the semantic web. And therefore, when we are around, and we are surprised to see that there's not much of implementation. The semantic web is very nice and exciting technologies with a lot of potential. I don't know to explain why it's not spread as we expected. I can say from my experience that at least in Israel, there is not a lot of semantic web implementation around, and the knowledge of people in this area is limited. I can assume that maybe it's because it's too flexible, and maybe it's give the option to do so many things that this flexibility is harm in the way that this technology can give a value. The people who try to work with those technologies, maybe, I don't know, I just make an assumption that in a way of inference is, in some way you can get the wrong answers if you're wrong in the way. So maybe it's a reason. I don't believe this is the reason. And again, I don't know why. And I don't think that it's old technology, because it can give a lot of value even today.
That's fine. I tend to agree with you, Elhanan. Florian, do you have any clue about what's wrong with the standards that are proposed already?
I guess that there's nothing wrong with the standards. No technical problem. I think there are social constraints to evolve in the semantic web, I guess. You mentioned that in the late 90s, it became a kind of a type of buzzword, semantic web. I remember when it happened, and there is the advantage of getting old is that I was a teenager at that moment, and that was a promise, the semantic web, and it didn't happen. I don't think there are problems with the standards or technical problems. I guess there are somehow social constraints, cultural diversity, that somehow doesn't allow it to make progress.
That's fine.
That's it.
That's an interesting point of view, Florian. Thanks. Jonathan, what do you think in practice? Have you tried using such standards already? And what do you think is wrong with them in order to avoid them to catch up?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think I'm probably of the same opinion as Florian. I don't think there's too much wrong with the standards per se. But I actually think that the fundamental blocker in terms of the adoption side of that is going to be cost, time, and knowledge. Those are really the key problems which we face. And knowledge is obviously one of the biggest areas, is that you might have a very, very large standard like the W3C standard as an example. And then within that standard, you've got multiple layers and you have multiple levels. And you have to actually have the intrinsic knowledge of how does this actually then apply to my organization? So it's really about, I think, understanding what that level of compliance is to those standards, and whether the actual business actually has the appetite to then spend the money to then get to that standard approach as well. So when you look at parliaments and when you look at the sort of traditional methods where they're just interested in publishing that information, say, to the public website, getting it into a form which is then looks nice and it's been presented in a nice way. Now, you could say that that could be compliant with the W3C standard, but at the same token, it may not be interoperable with other APIs, other data sources, etc., because that isn't necessarily the priority of the Parliament. So I think the key thing to look at that is that, you know, a lot of sort of from a technology perspective, there isn't too many blockers in terms of getting those sort of data sets to be sort of standardized around open API or data sets or W3C. It's going to be more of a case of having the knowledge or working with somebody who has the knowledge to say, well, what do you actually need to do to be compliant with certain standards? And why do you want to be compliant with those standards too? Because I think, you know, standards are out there, but it's up to the business, it's up to the organization to work out whether they actually truly need to be compliant with certain things. We had, in Australia, there was a whole of government approach where they said everything must be accessible by 2025, and everything must be compliant with the W3C standard version, you know, 2.0 or whatnot. Now, by making those sort of statements, we're injecting cost, we're injecting time, and we have to understand what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve with those standards as well.
Fine. Do you think it must be imposed by law or something like that, or
Yeah, regulation is really big. So I think, you know, by imposing it, it can introduce further complexity because people will rush an implementation without necessarily knowing what they're actually trying to comply with. So, you know, especially when we're dealing with, you know, government money, it's really important to understand what the context is and how you should be applying to those standards and what the benefit of those standards will be to your organization.
Mhm. That's fine. Standards are always brought to the fore when we talk about interoperability, and at the same time, there is a general idea that standards are awesome, especially when you can use your own standards. So no standardization at all. It's a huge problem. And what I would like to ask from you, that is there anything technical that such internet standards authorities such as the W3C might do, or do you think it's more it's more about making interoperability to enforce interoperability with laws, just as I ask it to Jonathan right now? Do you think is there something technical that still has to be done, or is it more political and more social in order the requirements to make data more interchangeable? What do you guys think? I would like to start with Elhanan, please.
I think it's both ways. It can be dictated from above, like a regulated, and it can work, as Jonathan said. And I don't know if it's the right way to dictate the standard itself. So usually you need to give the direction. What do you want to achieve? The standard is a way to achieve this. But it can come from the bottom up. It depends on the development teams working around and how they can reflect these issues to their superior, and maybe from bottom up you can convince, because a lot of time the people is in charge, and the political people or the managers, they don't know exactly about the technology. They need to explain them what is the advantage of use. So it can come from both direction, in my opinion.
Yes, bottom up and top down at the same time. Bruno, what do you think? What, in your opinion, could be done in order to improve interoperability or make it more easy to use?
Well, when it comes to interoperability, standards are crucial to facilitate communication and data exchange between systems. Interoperability standards are used quite frequently in the information technology industries, but in the legislative field, don't use. However, in the truth, it's true that there is still a lack of uniformity in open data system, which suggests that the standards proposed so far not being widely adopted. This may be due to several factors. In Mexico, such a lack of knowledge about these existing standards, or simple resistance to change, lack of incentives for their adoptions, and the lack of regulation focused in this issue.
I'm taking notes here. Sorry for taking a bit of time for that. Well, I think we're close to an end. I would like to ask all our audience about questions. Do you guys have any opinion, any question would you like to add something to the panelists, to ask something, you can use the chat. I think it's open from your organization. Let me just check. Yes, Luis Quimaides is telling me that we could ask our audience to raise hands here in Zoom, so we could know if they'd like to talk about. Yeah, Florian.
Can I make just a
oh,
consideration
sorry.
about your?
Sorry, I
okay.
forgot asking you. I'm sorry, please.
Okay, consideration. As I mentioned previously, I guess the cultural diversity is one of the issues that doesn't allow the standards to progress. One idea that I have, that Bruno mentioned the lack of incentives, for example. It could be tried in a regional level, for example. Brazil plays a leadership role in South America, for example. One idea that I have is to create a network of legislatures, for example, in countries of South America, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, for example, and stimulate the creation of standards. I guess that in a regional level would be something more feasible than establish it worldwide, for example. We have here an example of economic bloc of success of Mercosul, for example, in South America. So that's an idea that I have.
Yeah, that's fair enough. We are part with the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies and the Brazilian Federal Senate. We are part of the Interparliamentary Union, and we have an open data hub, a world open data hub, in order to discuss such things. But it still seems we are somewhat far of reaching that level of discussion. I guess there are still some issues about. There are different levels of maturity. I think that you guys, especially Jonathan, who is in touch with very different parliamentary houses everywhere in the world, there's a very different level of maturity about data opening among countries and world regions, and that makes anything about standardization hard to discuss. It seems we are still far from reaching it. Well, let's see. Do we have questions? I think we don't have any so far. Anyway, I would like to ask to our panelists to give their last words, their final opinions here, in order to allow us to finish this discussion. I'd like to start with Florian. Florian, could you please address your final words here?
Yes, no, I am enthusiastic of this subject of standardization and interoperability, and there is still a long way for us to reach it. So I guess panels like this, it's an important tool to promote the debate and somehow to find solutions to make it more feasible. I want to thank you for the invitation. It was an honor to participate of it.
Thank you very much, Florian. Bruno Rosas Fernández, Cámara de Diputados de Mexico. Would you like to give your final words?
Well, I just say thank you to all, to the opportunity of they're here. And I think we have many opportunities for improve the technology in our on our works, because in the parliamentary field we don't have many systems, almost in Mexico. In Mexico, many of the systems are very old. This is the truth. And this is a great opportunity for we, and thank you for all to listen to me.
Thank you very much, Bruno, on behalf of Bússola Tech. And I will add that working with legacy systems is also an issue here for us in Brazil, and I think that for many places in the world. Thank you very much, Bruno. Elhanan Schwartz from the Ministry of Justice of Israel. Thank you very much. Your final words, Elhanan.
Yes, first we are look at what happened in Brazil and what advance they have. You have in open the legislative documents and legislative data. It's very impressive, and we are very like it. And just to connect to what Florian said and to the last discussion. If we took an example from the patents world, we have, for example, in the Ministry of Justice, we have the patents office inside the Ministry of Justice as well as in other Ministry of Justice around the world, and we work by WIPO standard. This is the standard, general standard in the patents, and we are in Israel try to now convert all our legislative system to be in a common TOSO, as I mentioned before, we call it AKN4IL. And in this, we are building the URI structure according to the semantic web, to the common TOSO naming convention. And it's hard to do that. I think that maybe yes, if we have the opportunity, I don't know how, but like this event, or maybe to much more formalize, to build a standards specials to domains. It can help to promote these issues as well as the WIPO or the common TOSO standard.
Yeah, that's fine. And then thank you very much once more.
And thank you for the opportunity as well, and for all the interesting issues that rise here.
Yes, they're very interesting. I hope we can discuss further about the subject later, other opportunities as well. And Jonathan Ruckert from the NovaWorks company of Australia. Thank you very much once more, Jonathan, on behalf of Bússola Tech.
Yeah, so I think the key thing is that is if you are looking at sort of converting your existing data, make sure that it's in open formats, so not proprietary formats, I think is one of our sort of key takeaways. So XML, like as sort of Elhanan was saying, is that the Camatoso standard, etc., is XML based. And we publish a lot of information in XML for that particular rationale as well. However, you may have a lot of legacy systems in place as well. And there are actually technologies out there where you can put something in front of an older technology to then start to present that as a new way of actually operating with that data as well. So there are some cloud services and there are other sort of services as well, which can be actually used as a what we call a wrapper in front of your legacy systems as well. So there is technology out there to actually assist with that sort of work.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much once more, Jonathan. As I said, I hope we can discuss the topic in other opportunities as well. To all our audience, thank you very much for staying with us. I'd like to thank you once more. I am Fabricio Rocha I'm the systems manager for media and open data systems at the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies. And I hope to find you guys all in other discussions we have about the technological issues in legislative data, especially open data.